Howdy folks, got another Bladeslinger beat log for you, and yeah, I'm still talking about Doom, it's still on the brain. So, as I was playing Doom to prepare for the live stream this weekend, one of the videos I had playing on my laptop as I was playing through the game were videos on Doom console ports. Now, Doom is a game that has been everywhere. It's actually become a meme in recent years of can it run Doom, and then naming some weird off-the-ball electronic device, and then ending with yes, it can run Doom. And yeah, Doom can run all kinds of weird stuff. Let's see here, TX80 calculators. I think there's an Atari 2600 port. The kiosk at McDonald's. Pregnancy testers. Yeah, I always say that Sonic fans are crazy, but Doom fans are just as crazy, I would say. But the fun kind of crazy. So, yeah, Doom can run on a lot of weird things, but it's also had a very interesting life cycle when it comes to console ports. So, today I thought we'd run through a little history of all the weird console ports that have come out for Doom over the years. So, what we're specifically going to be looking at are, official console ports. So I know there are lots of fan-made ports, source ports, and of course ports for weird things that are not supposed to be video game consoles. But if I were to cover all that, this video would just go on forever, and I don't have the time or desire to go through all that. So we're just going to look at all the famous ports that have come out for the game, the official ports. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the first port I want to talk about is the Atari Jaguar port. Now this port is noteworthy because it was the only one that was fully developed by id Software. Some of you guys might be asking what the Atari Jaguar is. Well, the Atari Jaguar was a overhyped piece of junk that was reportedly 64-bit. However, it was not 64-bit. The reason they called it 64-bit was because it had two 32-bit processors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was 64. You don't just add the processors together. That just means you can divide up the duties of the individual chips and then go from there. And one of the chips was less powerful than the other, so it was more like a 16-bit chip. So yeah, pretty far removed from a 64-bit console. But it was technically the most powerful console of its day, which I guess is why id Software opted to port Doom to it. And for what it's worth, they actually did a pretty good job. Though there are some obvious concessions here. I mean, the graphics aren't nearly as sharp as the PC original. There are some levels missing, and what levels are there are truncated to some degree. But you know what? All things considered, Doom on the Atari Jaguar is really impressive. There are two things that make this a very undesirable port, however. First of all, it's on the Jaguar. I don't know if you guys have ever seen a Jaguar control. I really should have pulled up the picture to show you guys. But you only have 3 face buttons, a D-pad, and then a bunch of number keys. And while the number keys are actually useful because, they function the same way as hotkeys do on the PC version, the game is just really awkward to play with just the 3 buttons. You can't strafe or any of that stuff. So, yeah, not a terribly fun port to play. And also, it's missing the music. Supposedly the reason it doesn't have music is because Carmack opted to re-finagle the sound chip that the Jaguar had in order to have it performing other tasks for the game, like collision detection, for example. So that's why the game doesn't have music, and as a result, the game has come to be referred to as Silent Doom by a lot of fans. So if you're going to play it on Jaguar, if you must play it on Jaguar, I don't know why you would want to play Jaguar Doom. Really any other version of Doom apart from, what's available now on modern consoles or PC ports. Yeah, Jaguar is not that bad. Just be sure you put some music on to make up for the fact that there's no music. The Jaguar port would also serve as the basis for a bunch of other ports that follow in its wake. The most notable one being the Sega 32X port, which was actually the first official port of Doom. It actually came out before the Jaguar port. They also had a little bit of help from id Software on this one, but they didn't fully develop it. And it does kind of show because not only are the graphics worse, but it's missing even more levels. And it's also very buggy in regards to its programming too. For example, the BFG is in the game, but they never actually place the item drop for it, so you can only access it via cheat codes, which is like kind of crazy to think about, isn't it? The other noteworthy thing about this version of the game is it does have music. And wait till you get a load of this crap. Just turn that off for a second. Let's see, we were right here. Man, that's awful. But yeah, 32X, it's not a terrible port of the game. I mean, it plays about as well as the Jaguar version does. It does have the worst graphics, but the music is just really silly. Like, that Genesis sound chip, man, it's just terrible. But yeah, not the worst version of Doom, but you know it could be better if you played the Jaguar version. Now, going from the Jaguar to the 32X, you're expecting a drop in graphical quality because you are going from two 30-bit processors to 16-bit processors with the Sega 32X. It's not 32-bit for the record. So you expect a drop in graphical quality, and you're definitely expecting one for the Super Nintendo version, which is what you see here. You're just going to one 16-bit processor. So yeah, look at these graphics. This is just awful, dude. But you know what? It's impressive that this is running on the Super Nintendo at all. I mean, like, it looks like hot garbage, and it doesn't play nearly as well as the other two ports, aside from, having better controls in general. You can actually strafe and circle strafe in this game thanks to the shoulder buttons. But, all the levels are here, or at least all the levels that were in the Jaguar version. I think it might even have all the levels from the original game, too. But, yeah, it's impressive that they managed to get this on the Super Nintendo. I guess, you got the raw power of the Super Nintendo in addition to the Super FS chip. So, yeah, it must have been doable. It's also noteworthy for being one of the only SNES games that had the rated M for mature rating. The only other two were Mortal Kombat games. And since we are talking about a lot of music here, let's do a comparison with its soundtrack here. Yeah, it's not bad at all, is it? So yeah, the Super Nintendo port's probably the worst one we've looked at so far, but it is a incredible showpiece of what could be done on the Super Nintendo with a little bit of graphic know-how, so you gotta give it credit for that. Moving on, let's talk about what is arguably probably the worst port of Doom ever, and that is the 3DO port of the game. There is actually an amazing story behind this one. The 3DO port of Doom, well, first of all, what is the 3DO? It was an overpriced piece of junk that had a terrible business model attached to it that would inevitably sink the console before it ever got off the ground. You always gotta sell the console at a loss, and the reason for that is people aren't willing to shell out $700 for a console when you have a Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis being sold for like $299. But anyway, 3DO Doom, really interesting story behind this one. The 3DO port was done by Art Data Interactive, which was run by a fellow by the name of Randy Scott, who I would describe as a headstrong idiot with a lot of money. So after just a teeny bit of success with some other licensed games he was doing at the time, he picked up the Doom license, which was honestly a really bad move on his part because id Software wanted to weed out any unworthy developers, priced the license for the 3DO port of Doom incredibly high. I think it was like a $250,000. So, and that was just too expensive for it because like the best-selling 3DO games only sold like maybe 100,000 copies, and if you do the math on that, you're not going to make 2,500 off of that. 250,000 off of that. So that right there was a bad idea. But it also didn't help that the man knew nothing about game design. So where do I start with this one? First of all, he only got one person to program the game. Before she even started, he started hyping the game up, so he was making all kinds of insane feature requests, like online play, new levels, new weapons, and cutscenes. It would actually tell a story. And in addition to that, he ordered far more copies of the game than he should have, so he was just, blowing all kinds of money. So yeah, it was just a project that was doomed from the get-go. And the only reason it ever saw the light of day was because of the one programmer that ended up working on it, Rebecca Heinemann, otherwise known as Burger Becky, an incredibly talented programmer with lots of experience in the industry, managed to, work around Randy Scott's incompetence. For starters, she had worked on Doom ports before, so she was able to get the Jaguar source code for the game. Randy Scott, he claims to have had the source code, but he never gave it to her. And in addition to that, when asked where it was, he was confused. He thought that she could make the game just by having a copy of the game, which is ridiculous. But yeah, she managed to get the Jaguar working on the 3DO, which was no small feat because the Jaguar was just a mess to program for. She was able to get it done, and this is the result you see. The frame rate is awful. The controls are even worse here. And even though this is running at full screen here, in order for it to run at an acceptable frame rate, which was 15 frames per second, they actually had to shrink the screen resolution in order to pull that off. But because Rebecca Heinemann's contract with Art Data Interactive, required her to have full screen, she put a cheat code in there that would allow it to run at full screen. So she would fulfill that obligation and collect her paycheck. So yeah, by all accounts, 3DO Doom is just such an awful piece of crap game. But it is impressive that it even came out at all. They made this thing in 10 months, which is just insane to think about. And it just got torn apart by critics when it came out, and is widely considered to be the worst port of Doom. It does have one saving grace though, and that is the soundtrack. Take a listen to this. That's actually pretty damn rad, and believe it or not, that was actually done by Randy Scott himself. I gotta give the man credit. He is a pretty decent musician. But apart from that and his business incompetence too, it's been recently revealed that Randy Scott is an awful individual. I'm not going to talk about what has brought that to light because it's honestly a little disturbing. But I will praise his musical acumen, but the man can go straight to hell, and preferably the part of hell that Doom Guy happens to be ripping and tearing his way through. Screw you, dude. Anyway, moving on, and now we're getting to the port that really inspired me to do this video, and that's the PlayStation port, which is probably the best port of Doom that we've looked at so far. For starters, for the first time, the entirety of Doom is here, aside from maybe one or two levels, but the levels they chose to get rid of are ones that I don't particularly like in Doom, so that's a good thing. But in addition to that, it's also Ultimate Doom. So you got the 4th episode in there too. And even Doom 2. I mean, that is a hell of a lot of content for a game that people have struggled just to get the basic version running on. On top of that, it runs pretty well. There's actually some graphical enhancements here. It's a little hazy, but you expect that from the PlayStation. But, and some really cool animated skyboxes too. But the most interesting part of the PlayStation port of Doom is the music. Take a look and listen to this. Yeah, so interesting thing about Doom for the PlayStation, it goes full on horror with the soundtrack. It completely changes the tone of the game. It puts you on edge and turns Doom into a more horrifying game than it usually is, which is saying something because Doom is it can be a pretty scary game at times. So yeah, that soundtrack was done by Aubrey Hodges, who is just an expert at that kind of thing. And it easily makes Doom for the PlayStation 1 probably the best port of Doom from its day. In fact, I would even say that this version of the game is still worth checking out today. There are plenty of mods that change the PC version of Doom to feature the soundtrack. So yeah, if you're curious what it's like to play it with the new music, be sure to check that out. So yeah, PlayStation version, excellent version of the game, highly recommended. That version of Doom would also serve as essentially practice for the Nintendo 64 game Doom 64, which in essence was just Doom 3, but it takes the horror atmosphere to a whole new level and is one of the most underrated games ever released for the N64. But we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on Doom 64 here because it is its own original game. I know the title Doom 64 is a little misleading, but it is more than just Doom on the N64. The one that is a straight port, though, is the Sega Saturn version. And this is just a straight port of the PS1 version of the game. Just awful. The frame rate is bad. It's a lot darker. The controls are alright, so it plays okay. But it's almost as bad as the 3DO port. It's surprising to me that this game is as bad as it is because, the 32X was, well, not 32X, Sega Saturn was known as a 2D powerhouse, so you think Doom would be a surefire thing on it. But I guess when you're making a port from the PlayStation to the Sega Saturn, it's not always going to work that well. Should have got Labami Software, the guys behind Power Slave, or Exhumed as some people call it, to do it, because they did really good things with Duke Nukem on the Sega Saturn as well as Quake. So yeah, do not recommend the Saturn version. And the last port of all these weird console ports is actually the handheld port, and that's Doom on the GBA, which sounds like another fool's errand, but if they can get it on the Super Nintendo, surely they can get it on the Game Boy Advance. And you know what? They pulled it off pretty well. While it's still very hard to play due to the limited control nature of the Game Boy Advance, it really is damn impressive that Doom is on this thing. And, impressive to boot. It's like the entire game is here. I don't know how they pulled that off. It's just borderline black magic. But as I said, and again, we're talking about the music, so let's listen to the soundtrack from the GBA game. Oh man, that's like the Doom soundtrack as interpreted by Stomp, doesn't it? But yeah, the Game Boy Advance game is pretty impressive, though. There really isn't any point to playing any of these Doom console ports anymore, because today we have essentially PC perfect ports of Doom now. That's what I played last night for the live stream, and the version there is also essentially the version that was released in the special edition of Doom 3 for the Xbox, and later as part of the Doom 3 BFG edition. These versions of the game are as close to perfect as possible. There are some minor differences in there. One thing I've always heard is that the tempo for the music is a little bit slower. But again, that's something that only people who religiously know the original PC version are going to notice. Also, in the Nintendo Switch version, like they had to replace the red cross on the med kits with a new logo, because around that time, I guess the Red Cross trademarked that, so you had to pay money to use it, which I think is a little silly that they're dissuading people from putting that on their med kits now, because, you know, the Red Cross, I mean, that's positive marketing, I would say, but whatever. Yeah, all these versions of the game are just fine, and if you've never played Doom before, I highly recommend them. I know a lot of people were pissed off with these ports, namely for the fact that in order to play them, you had to subscribe to Bethesda.net. But even then, it wasn't that bad. You could just sign up and then unsubscribe to all the junk mail they send you. And then later on, they patched that out. So yeah, it's not a problem anymore. You can still pick up these games and play it. And having Doom on the go is fantastic. They run perfectly on the Switch. So yeah, that pretty much does it for Doom console ports. And it's remarkable to think the shelf life that Doom had, my man. I mean, like, Doom came out in 1993, and like, for every console generation after it seemed like there was always someone trying to port it to the consoles. So that really speaks volumes of how good Doom is and how much people love it. It's just one of those games that's always going to sell regardless. Unfortunately, the era of weird console ports of Doom has ended because, again, now we have PC perfect console ports. So there isn't a point to, you know, trying to finagle it to work on weird hardware anymore. But yeah, that's the history of Doom console ports. I hope you guys enjoyed it. You all have a good work week, and I'll see you next weekend.